You're listening to the Indie 500 podcast, where each week we break down a different album from the NME Top 500 Albums list. However, if you're hearing this episode, you're in store for one of our pit stops where we take a moment to further explore a musician, genre, or scene. Today we are diving deeper into Krautrock after a review of Noi 75, number 163 on the NME Top 500. Admittedly, this is a genre and scene that Brady and I know very little about, but are eager to learn more. And to help us with that today, we've invited some special guests. Our guest now is Alex Henkle, who has a chapter in the Cambridge Companion to Krautrock. Alex, thanks so much for joining us and helping guide us into a much larger world of Krautrock. Why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself?
Sure, thank you, Phil. I decided to study Krautrock when I was studying English. I got really into music studies and learned that you could write a lot about that. And actually, my professor, Ulrich Adelt, led me into writing this chapter. I've been a big music enthusiast. I first heard about Krautrock when I was in high school. I was really into Radiohead, and they were a big influence on them. And looking up their influences, I was just surprised that you could even make sounds that sounded like this. It just sounded like nothing I'd ever heard before. So my own chapter was on Faust, but Noi definitely played a pretty formative part when I first heard Hallo Gallo off of their first album. Pretty good stuff.
Yeah, I didn't hear that one until after listening to 75, but if I'm starting to pick songs to define the genre for me, that's when it sticks out, and it's really good. You talked about studying music. Is there like a particular artist, album, song that drew you into the krautrock scene and really just got you hooked? And from there, it was, this is my jam?
I would definitely say Can's Tago Mago was probably the first one. If you don't know, the first half, it's very jammy and loose and psychedelic. The second half gets very avant-garde, and so it kind of scared me off but eased me into those stranger sounds. And then when I first heard Faust 1, it's more influenced by, it was an influence, I should say, on industrial and noise music. A lot of tape experiments in that one. And so I think both of those albums definitely helped draw me into the scene more and more and made it something that I studied later on. So
Yeah, I listened to the Can one a couple days ago, and it was one I instantly put on repeat again. It was just like, okay, am I hearing two different albums here, or what's going on? A lot of cool sounds going on, but super, super interesting music. So I guess, as we've been exploring krautrock a little bit this week for our show, I think we had our misconceptions coming into it. My previous exposure was one song, and that's The Robots by Krautrock. Mm-hmm. I thought it was all just pop, pre-techno type sounds, and it scared me away from the genre. But now that I'm getting into it, I see it's so much more. So I'm wondering if you could explain krautrock as maybe more of a scene than just a genre.
Yeah, so it's definitely a very loosely defined scene. Obviously, you had some of that poppier stuff, like with Kraftwerk, and even with some of the techno stuff. Donna Summer's "I Feel Love" was actually produced in Germany later down the road. But before that, it was really came about with the larger psychedelic scene. Obviously, a lot of prog bands popping up all throughout Europe. And it was the British press that labeled krautrock to define this kind of loose, all-together scene of just people who are doing these looser jams, psychedelic, but obviously a lot less optimistic, as I think you heard with Can. It's less flower power and more just weird, out there stuff.
Drop some acid and jam, and exactly.
And there was a lot of studio recording sessions where some of the producers would secretly give acid to the musicians and just kind of record whatever came out. Very prevalent all throughout, for sure.
I mean, hey, we talked about Funkadelic last week. It worked for them.
If it works. And then there was also a lot of other stuff in the air. Most of the starting bands with krautrock actually studied classical music at the university. The leader of Can, Uli, I think he actually studied under Stockhausen specifically, and some of his avant-garde electronic music. People like Vares and Koenig coming out at that time who were doing stuff with tape and electronic music. Mixing high and low art. The Beatles were doing some of the same stuff, but they clearly took it a lot further. And also some jazz music from kind of the European free jazz scene, and this other thing they termed komisch music. It's kind of like a proto ambient, because it became really influenced on Brian Eno later when he collaborated with some of these people in the krautrock scene. But in German it translates to cosmic music, and it was more so just kind of this loosely new age but also very electronic sound.
That floating through space, exactly.
Yeah. And sort of just trying to get at this universal identity, this sort of high ideal of what music could do to somebody. Um, Very psychedelic, acid influenced, of course. But
definitely. No, a good product of the late 60s and 70s. And yeah, definitely something that caught my attention right away. This isn't Kraftwerk, poppy, Devo type stuff at all. This is Pink Floydish more than anything. So a cool exploration. So there's a lot of genres within the scene. Where would you say nowadays we're seeing the impact? You mentioned Radiohead as a band that's really admitted to the influence from krautrock. What are some others that maybe people wouldn't be as quick to think of?
Well, I mean, immediately afterwards, the influence they had on England, as some of these German bands were traveling over and playing shows in England, because they weren't very big in Germany. They were much big in the West, bigger in the Western Europe kind of area. You then had a rise in sort of like John Linden cites a lot of these bands for punk music, but then also the stuff that happened after the Sex Pistols, like Public Image Limited. I mean, you have what's that band called? I can't get away, or whatever it's called. The Sound. That first song off of that album sounds just like Noé. And so that post-punk scene, and then when industrial music and noise music started coming about with people like Throbbing Gristle, I think you had a huge influence on that, and how they then spilled over to people like Merzbow in the later music scene in the 90s, the noise scene, I mean. So kind of it just spread out with a lot of that avant-garde type of stuff. Obviously with Kraftwerk, you get more of the influence on the mainstream pop sound, but you also had jammy bands like King Gizzard were pretty influenced by Can, I would say.
Yeah, I could see that now. Yeah.
But yeah, so it's just kind of all over the place, people taking what they can get out of it. But I mean, this is the first moment as well you really get a major electronic presence in pop rock music. So I think you kind of have to owe it to where studio music went after that to krautrock and what.
Yeah, I mean, it went in so many directions with the EDM type stuff. You mentioned Brian Eno, just even hip hop borrows some of the mentalities and samples behind it. It's everywhere, even though it's such a genre and scene that seems to be maybe not getting its proper flowers and respect in terms of history.
Right. And if you want to talk about sampling, Noé 2, they actually just took all their songs on Noé 1 and just made them faster and slower. I mean, it was basically you could say proto vaporwave in a way, right? And
exactly, it was we need to honor this contract, so let's do some remixes before they're called remixes, and line up with a pretty fun product.
Yeah, and that idea of looping music as well. I mean, you brought up techno, and it was a pretty big influence on techno in weird ways, and where Berlin particularly went with techno, bands like Basic Channel and stuff. It's definitely a huge influence, I think, all over that electronic music scene. So
absolutely. So I guess I'm curious, is there still a scene with this mentality today, or has that kind of experimental krautrock genre, has that kind of faded into the past? It reminds me a lot of ways of the grunge movement we had in Seattle, where it's this kind of generic catch-all term for all these different bands and acts, and there's still a Seattle music scene, but maybe not with the same spirit as before.
Yeah, I mean, like I told you earlier, the krautrock scene, weirdly enough, never even took off in Germany. It was mostly people in England who were listening to this music. And so in that sense, most of the people who were playing together just played together because they knew each other through the producers. It wasn't exactly like they met each other at shows or anything. And so nowadays, the German music scene, there's not really a ton of stuff. And I think the internet has also just exploded everything to the point where if you see a band that's very krautrock influenced, like King Gizzard, or even like Tortoise in the 90s, the post-rock kind of movement, it just kind of pops up all over the place. Yeah, it's definitely not so much a German thing anymore.
Okay.
I don't think. And the stuff I do hear out of Germany, much more poppier and electronic, or even like sometimes you'll hear a prog band here or there, but across Europe. So
yeah. So definitely it's spread its wings and flown all over the world, but maybe not staying home anymore.
Yeah.
From this movement, are there any new like technologies that came out of it? Studio tricks? I think you mentioned like the tape looping and things of that nature. What are some things in terms of production that maybe we owe to the krautrock scene?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot going on. I told you about the tape looping and that idea of just a song as being a moment repeated over and over again. Connie Plank, the person who produced Noise 75 and Noy and Kraftwerk's other works, had this whole idea of being able to use technology in order to create like feedback systems, right? I mean, you can talk about psychedelic movement with feedback and guitar and stuff like that, but
Right.
he also thought like the way you can use synthesizers and have them respond to people as feedback, respond to your brain, right, and ears and stuff like that, biofeedback methods. That gets kind of into academic territory, but he would have filters, for example, that would actually the amount on the filter would change depending on how hard the drummer hits, and using
Oh,
sensors
okay.
like that to get some stuff going. He was also just really interested in environments, hence why you have so much reverb, that idea of making kind of like inner space and to have that outer space feeling. Um, and so in general, it was just a lot more processed effects going on to the instruments, a lot more phasing kind of tricks that they use to make it sound more synthetic, I think, that had the most influence, and just being able to use noise as an instrument. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely a step forward from Jimi Hendrix just holding the guitar up to the amp. A lot more manipulation and just outside of the box thinking for sure.
But
Uh,
yeah. And the
so
different ways they
yeah,
would play guitar too,
totally.
just less solos and more just sound, right?
Right. We talked about Connie Plank a little bit on our episode and kind of his role as the lukewarm water between the two guys in the band. What would you say his role is? Did he really provide them with the tools to paint the canvas, or was he more of just the guy to bring it all together and make the relationship work?
There's definitely a lot of debate about the extent to what he was doing. I mean, he really liked to get a live sound, so he would just set bands jamming for a while and then select afterwards the best moments, kind of splicing the tape. You hear it over Noy 75, how it just kind of has this like refined, perfect sound, even though it's very jammy and open
Yeah.
ended. So I think in that sense, he definitely did a lot of stuff just refining those ideas. You could also talk about, I believe it was E-Music, where it has that weird kind of phased effect of the doubleness of the drums with each hit and stuff like that. I definitely think that's all Connie Plank. Whereas obviously the other two coming into there came in with this mindset of just making this chill kind of sound, jamming it out, seeing what goes onto the tape. And I think Connie just letting them have that and like not marketing it towards making it more a pop sound, right? Letting them just have a song that's a jam without a singer and no melody. It's
Right.
just time tracking, basically, right? I had a student, actually, I put it on one day in class, who called it clock music. And I thought that was funny. Um, but letting that happen, just letting that kind of exploration and not interrupting it too much, I think was really the role he played.
Yeah. Helping facilitate more than direct it. Yeah.
Yeah, and then once you had the sort of creative differences between the two initial members, and obviously later when was it Roth who brings in his brother to finish the
Yeah.
second half of the album? Yeah, Michael Rother, right? Uh, Playing the second half of the album with the new drummer, and I think him just trying to keep it all together to make something they could at least release, right?
Oh,
Um,
exactly. Yeah, from what we've read up and heard, it was definitely a bit of a end of the relationship project where it was like even to the point of literally you can have side A, I'll have side B.
oh
So
yeah,
somewhere in between, somebody had to bring it together, and it sounds like he was the guy to make it happen.
yeah, that's a pretty good way to put it. Um,
So the term krautrock gets thrown around a lot, and you mentioned some other ones. What I found, of course, in studying and reading up some other bands I listened to, Faust 4, the first track off that, Krautrock. Pretty awesome song. So you wrote a little bit about Faust. Where do they factor into the scene? What was their role?
Faust are, I mean, again, the scene was very much all over the place. And Faust was even a weird one in there because they were not in all these other bands. They lived on their own commune and kind of just recorded at home. When they got to Faust 4, they were actually living in England at the time. So they had
Hmm.
a studio. Sounds a lot better than their first two albums. And you had Uli Trepte, who was playing with Guru Guru, but for the most part, they were just kind of insular in their commune and made their own stuff. So when they go over to England, they're touring with bands like Gong and Henry Cow, if you've ever heard of them, weird prog space kind of outfits.
Yeah.
And England in general, just listening to what they're doing and calling it krautrock. I feel like I remember in an interview the main guy talking about how he felt kind of dissatisfied with that, like it didn't describe their sound. In general, the label krautrock might have been considered as kind of a stereotype or a way to kind of push Germany outside the mainstream prog music scene. And ways to sort of label German identity further. Obviously, after World War II, German identity underwent kind of a lot of stereotypes. If you ever had a German character in a TV show, almost always a Nazi, right? And like a butt of the joke. And so Faust, all these stereotypes being called krautrock all the time are like, oh yeah, we'll play you some krautrock. And of course, pure wall of noise, just like radios, guitars, and then the drums don't even come in till halfway through this 10-minute song. It's kind of like just like a I don't know, middle finger to the music press, like we'll play whatever we want, and if you want to call us this, sure, we'll be that too, right? Sort of in your face. The term itself, of course, was used before Faust came along. I think it was actually my teacher, Dr. Adelt, who pointed at Amandul's first album, Psychedelic Underground, the song Mama Duel and her sauerkraut band play on, right? And so then that term sauerkraut shortened to kraut and sticking as just a label for all this weird music coming out of Germany.
Melody Maker ran with it from there, and label was born. Yeah. No, that's interesting. You bring up the German anti-German sentiment a little bit, even though they broke big in England. That was something I was wondering a little bit about, that relative closeness to the war and everything, and just seeing like, is that kind of a backhanded way to label these musicians, or is that just like, well, whatever, it works, we're gonna go with it? But
right, and you can even see then what scenes they influenced afterwards, like the industrial scene and the punk scene being very much kind of this angry counterculture to the larger music scene in the 70s. I think you can see why they would be so attracted to this sort of outsider kind of identity, things they're not supposed to incorporate into mainstream culture or something, right? But of course, for the Germans actually playing the music, it was also a split thing for them, right? Because they want to sort of reconcile with their past. How much of German culture, you even see it today with the way people talk about figures like Wagner and Nietzsche, right? And what can be German without being considered sort of like proto-Nazi and stuff.
Right.
And how do we then make new music as a counterculture without sort of being part of this oppressive German identity, while also trying to explore who I am. And there's certainly some ways that haven't aged as well as others with some of the new agey stuff that they did. This sort of universal identity. They were very interested in Native American aesthetics at times. But for the most part, it's like you see in a way, right? These songs without singers, this stripped down kind of just minimal mode of being. I don't know if that makes sense, but
it's very much like a minimalist Velvet Underground, Andy Warhol type mentality of like, we don't need to overproduce this. I'm bringing you a melody. I'm going to have the little motoric beat in the background to drive it. But beyond that, I don't need to wow you with over the top stuff. It's kind of elegant but simple,
Exactly. Yeah.
So curious, you brought up the commune thing with Faust, and I'd heard mention of a couple other bands in that proto-punk vein where like they built communes quite literally. I wondered if you could shed some light on that, and was that a common thing, or is that just, hey, we're gonna bring in people and live our artistic lives together?
I mean, yeah, you can definitely even see that happening in the American and British scenes as well, with bands like I don't know if they were necessarily commune, but the Incredible String Band and Jefferson Airplane. That sort of California scene had a lot of that aesthetic too. Just sort of people deciding to live communally together as sort of a reaction against this kind of capitalist movement. Mao was getting big at the time. As a matter of fact, you saw that in Germany with the Baader Meinhof movement, and there's sort of rumors that in the Faust Commune, people from Baader Meinhof were staying there at times, and cops would come in and just break down their doors trying to find these people. But especially with Krautrock, you had Amandul, who were a pretty big commune, and then the band sort of split into the old Amandul and Amandul 2, who left the commune because sort of some disagreements with how they were running things. I remember it was a strict commune from what I read about it. They banned alcohol for being too bourgeois, right? And
I can think of a lot of reasons, but that's probably not one I'd come up with. Yeah.
Yeah, right. But there were a lot of communes showing up throughout Germany at that time, and throughout the U.S. as well, just part of that counterculture, psychedelic kind of universal togetherness mentality. So,
yeah, creating our own families through values and just that togetherness.
Yeah.
Well, it's really interesting, though. Something we don't see as much these days, obviously.
Oh, yeah.
So now that we have Noi 75 under our belt, myself, my co-host, and possibly the listeners, where would you go next?
Oh, well, Noi themselves, honestly, 75 is an interesting option for the NME to pick for this album. I feel like, at least I prefer their first album for just the more stripped down, sort of bare, mechanical kind of feeling. They had their own separate side projects afterwards, of course. Klaus Dinger went on to make La Dusseldorf, which is also this very glossy kind of sound, whereas Rother went on with Harmonia, which is more new agey, that ambient kind of feeling, as you saw with side 1 and side 2 on both of these albums. But I would honestly recommend, they were both part of early Kraftwerk. And before they went sort of Man Machine and the robots and stuff like that, they actually played... Oh, sorry, my cats. They actually played a lot of the same kind of just driving beat, minimal stripped down synth kind of rock. Kraftwerk's first album, the band themselves disowned it, but I feel like you can see a lot of that influence and what it evolved into. And that's honestly one of my probably top 10 of the whole scene is just Kraftwerk's first album. Definitely a really good one.
I had heard that they disconnected themselves from those first couple of records. Is there something in particular that they stand out as like, either we didn't contribute and like this, or it doesn't jive with the rest of our catalog? What's the thinking behind that?
Well, I mean, it's hard to exactly say. Obviously, both members of Noi were part of Kraftwerk at that time, and then right after the first album just left. And the second album has no drums on it, right? So that's when they kind of lose that rock feeling. Later, you have stuff like Autobahn and Trans-Europe Express, where it's just all synthesizers and becomes part of that sort of proto-techno, early electronic, almost even like a Moog exploitation kind of feel with just how happy those synths are and stuff. You know? The first album, it's much more rock. And even though there's like that electronic stuff, it's very noisy. It's still kind of... I don't know, cutesy feeling in a way, but if you listen to their live recordings at the time, there's a really good unreleased album or live album, I think, where they sound almost like Sabbath, like just how heavy it actually sounded in performance. I think it was just kind of a shift in philosophy. And so when they became more of this post-human man-machine thing, they just left that behind. But
we had that phase, but that was when we were younger. That's not us anymore. And
exactly, yeah. But I think you can still see some connections, particularly to the sound of Autobahn, just that motorique 4 on the floor kind of driving rhythm with the synths on top.
So that's a term we've come across several times as well, the motorique. I'm wondering if you could shed some more light. Is there like a particular origin point to that, or why that word pops up so much?
No, it's there were other terms for it at the time flown around too. I can't remember which band called it the Apache beat as well, right? How I was telling you about some of those Native American aesthetics. but it was just kind of considered like, obviously every single beat you have a kick drum, that repetition, being able to just push things forward, sort of. It's not quite aggressive either, it's just kind of keeping time.
Steady.
Definitely defined a lot of just that energy and kind of cosmic feeling they were going for. It shows up in the first M on Dual album, even shows up in the first Kraftwerk album. I don't necessarily know that you can point to something and say this is where it started. Even Velvet Underground were doing it before this all started, but just sort of, I think that energy is what really drove it. With Noe in particular, right? You could talk about Noe's first album as being this kind of like capitalist joke, right? The word itself means new in German. It was kind of like an advertising slogan, like, oh, new, we have a sale here at the store, right? And so putting that on an album cover, you put it on the turntable, it's just this repetitive sound with no singer, no lyrics, like points to kind of the paradox of the motorik, right? It's both moving forward, like on an Autobahn, you're driving on the road,
Right.
utopian kind of vision, but it's also staying in place. It's a loop, the same thing
You're
happening
seeing the
over
same
and
tree
over.
the whole drive, and exactly.
Yeah. And so, in that sense, a lot of people look at the motorik and read it as this sort of like parody statement, almost like a capitalist accelerationist thing in some weird ways. Just like, where can we push this capitalist drive for repetition to the point where it doesn't even make sense anymore, but also like it's avant-garde now. It changes your perception of the music, right?
Right.
um, so a little bit of both of that going on, but it's definitely a pretty popular rhythm, I think, that defines what a lot of bands were doing with just the feeling of the music. So
Yeah, it just adds this extra layer of catchiness to each song too. Having it in there, you have the standard melodies and everything going on, but having that beat, it's just, I don't need to turn this off. I don't need to skip this. I can just keep driving with this. I can keep getting work done. Like, very steady and soothing. I love it.
yeah, I my professor even said, like, if anything, the singer in these bands is probably the drummer, because they're what's really holding the main sonic space, right?
Right. Right.
So
So now that we're into Krautrock a little bit, I'm curious. Say we've got a couple more albums in. What's one that maybe is a little bit underrated or more challenging of a listen that you might advocate for that we should check out?
oh man, well, I have a long list of albums I could talk about, so stop me if I get too far.
No, let's go for it.
Um,
Yeah.
Obviously, you've heard Can's Tago Mago, wild album. If you ever listen to their first album, Monster Movie, it's a little less popular, more garage rock, but
Okay.
it's doing much of the same thing. Something about that one. Their opening song, they say they tried to rip off Velvet Underground's European Sun, but just like you hear the loop right there, and it's even a really early example in the scene. It's just a solid album. With Faust, obviously you need a very adventurous listener, but Faust 1 was a statement, just noise and tape loops. And I mean, they sound drunk when they're singing half the time. They made rumors they just made the whole thing in one night. I don't know that that's true, considering how uh, well together it's put, but it's definitely a very messy album, but I think can show you those avant-garde influences. And it's my favorite of the whole scene, but it's a tough listen, right? It's like the Trout Mask replica of Krautrock, if you will.
Okay.
And they're very influenced by Zappa too, so there's
Right.
a lot going into there with that. Popol Vuh, they're kind of a really popular one because they scored Aguirre and all of Herzog's, a few of Herzog's films, I should say.
Okay.
But in Den Garten Pharos, they include a lot of folk kind of influence with the new agey stuff, and it gets really good. I like Amandul, of course, the very loose, jammy sound. Brain Ticket's not one you talk about a lot because they didn't actually even live in Germany at the time, but they were doing much the same thing on their Cottonwood Hill album. Very interesting proto space rock album. Um, and then, of course, you had a lot of really stonery, hard, heavy rock. If you look up Silberbart, Four Times Round Raisin, that album is just really heavy, good stuff.
Okay. No, I mean, it definitely hit me, got me, my interest peaked on that. Yeah. Stoner metal rock,
Oh yeah, no, it was also a really big influence. If you listen to Amandul 2's Yeti, that one's also another heavy one, pretty popular one, but just good jams. So
nice. Excellent.
yeah.
Okay. So a lot to check out. I love it. As we wind down a little bit, are there any takeaways that if you were asked, like, hey, Krautrock is more than just that label, what is something you'd want somebody to learn about Krautrock that maybe they hadn't thought of before or heard before?
I guess I think Krautrock holds such an important cultural point because of how it shows the kind of creative experiments that can come about when people are working outside the mainstream, right? You have this very organic, just self-led movement of these Germans trying to replicate the sounds that they like and hear, right? Beatles getting big, Jefferson Airplane getting big, Zappa even getting big, and just trying to make their own thing with it. And I think the way that it then spilled over and influenced the rest of music for the next few decades just goes to show that, right, when you really try to do your own thing, it can work out and make an impact on the world. So
Yeah, no, I love that. Absolutely. I can't lie. The idea of setting up a commune and just jamming and making music, like even for a weekend, that sounds great, let alone a couple of months.
oh yeah.
And that get the group together and seeing what happens sounds super fun. So again, thank you so much for your time today. Before
Yeah,
we head out, is there any books, websites, social media stuff you'd like to plug? Where can we track you down and learn a little bit more?
of course. I mean, obviously, you can read my Cambridge book to Krautrock if you want to look it up. I have my chapter in there. I don't think it's a great chapter, but definitely shows some of the stuff I was interested in academia. But if you want to learn more about Krautrock, Julian Cope's Krautrock Sampler, classic book, really good book. Hard to get an actual physical copy of it, but just excellent coverage with the mythos and kind of the legendariness of the scene. Ulrich Adelt's Krautrock, German music in the 70s, a little more academic, but just really well researched, and I think covers a lot of those more abstract concerns I think we talked about. So if you wanted to read two books about those, I would just recommend those two for sure.
Awesome. No, definitely gonna add some to the wish list and see if I can't track them down.
Oh, yeah.
Sounds like a challenge more than anything to see if I can find them now. So I'm looking forward to it.
Nice.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Alex.
No,
Appreciate your
not a
time.
problem.
And man, we are a little bit more informed than we were a week ago. I tell you that much.